I think spiritual life is not that easy if we're serious about it, right? As we talk about ideal and God's love and how to love each other and support each other and create ideal families, and that's all really important, the ideal, right? But spiritual life is a lot more complicated because we are not just dealing with the ideal, we are dealing with ourselves, with fallen nature, within us. And I think one of the most important things in our spiritual life is to have substantial victories in challenging spiritual fallen nature within ourselves and within others. Right? That's part of our spiritual life. And if we study Father's life, it's the reason why his life was so difficult was because of that, right? Because taking responsibility for a fallen environment that's very complex and very far from God's love, and how to find the way back, right? How to work in that way. So a few points in that direction, and I hope it's not too burdensome or heavy, but I hope if for some of us maybe being serious about our spiritual life, it might give us some pointers or some direction. So I ended my talk with just a very simple advice. Remember, no resentment. That was the end. So the few points I had after that, I on Thursday decided it's too much, too late, so I stopped. But there are 2-3 points, and I want to expand a little bit on it this morning, because I think it's actually quite helpful. And no resentment sounds easy, doesn't it? I'll be all right. I won't, I won't become bitter and negative. I'll manage. But I don't think it's that easy. And I think if we're realistic, I mean, I guess I've been around for quite some time, longer than most of you, and my parents, like I shared before, right, were around much longer. And in reality, I think not just in our movement, but also in the world and society, it's not a particular problem of our movement, but becoming bitter, resentful, burdened, damaged in this world, in this society, but also in our movement is quite common, actually. So I'm sure if we're serious, we may also face that within ourselves, and I think it's maybe necessary to consciously confront it. And why is it so? Why is resentment so dangerous or so? How do you say? So difficult. I think one way I would see resentment. I'm not going to give a long talk and detailed explanation of what resentment is and so on, because just a very short overview, because it's just a word in a sense, right? In Korean, the word han and the word resentment is quite different, and there's also like a positive resentment and there's a negative resentment and being bitter. There's many nuances, so I don't want to look at that, but I just want to say, like, I would just use the word resentment for the overarching, I would say, thing that Satan uses to claim victory in the end, right? And that's something that if we look at history in the Bible, if we look at people's personal lives or testimony, is very common, right? And that's why, if you watch woke series like Lord of the Rings, the new Amazon Lord of the Rings, there's one quote I like in there, and we've mentioned it before, and I think it resonates, like, evil doesn't sleep, it waits. And that's one way I think fallen nature works in our lives, and we should be very serious and very aware of it. That, we can have a long life of mission and fulfillment and sacrificing for God and doing a lot. But if in the end, right, somehow we are resentful, or we start regretting, we start feeling maybe I didn't get the value I needed, or if we were mistreated and someone took away my sacrifice, right? And that's one way Satan in the end can take away everything, right? And that happens quite often in our spiritual life and for many people. So it's one thing to be, and it's very common, just saying. So in our church also, and I know many elders, second generation, who I would say were affected by that. And resentment is very different. It's not like this guy's really angry, bitter. It can be also just become callous or indifferent, or just I'm not interested. I want to go a different way, or I'm not interested in spiritual things because we project things together. So, in a sense, when we are young, we can be very ambitious, very idealistic, right? In our spiritual life, we want to do something. We want to change the world. That's quite common, right? We want rebellious. We want to change society. Very ambitious and idealistic, and we're willing to invest, willing to work hard, willing to face some challenges. And eventually life does become more challenging, maybe than we expected. We face challenges we don't know how to solve. We feel helpless, powerless to resolve. We are mistreated or cheated by others, right? We don't get the recognition we wanted. We felt like, I'm going to do this, and people don't appreciate that as the way we want, and so on. And eventually, when resentment starts moving in, what happens is we start reevaluating everything, right? In reverse. And that's how Satan claims victory, right? So, we go through different struggles and sufferings, like in our blessing, and it breaks up. And in hindsight, we start reevaluating what happened in a way that makes us feel comfortable, but it takes away kind of our internal victory. Does that make sense? Right? So resentment is quite tricky, and it's not so straightforward. Maybe another way to say it is resentment is internalized pain, right? That we've accepted, and that's why it's so tricky, is because we accept it as I'm responsible. That's how Satan really likes to destroy us, right? Not attacking you, but making you part of something that is evil, that is wrong, and making you guilty and feel. Does that make sense? Right? And because of that, we lose power, we lose our spiritual life, and facing God becomes challenging, right? And in some form, it starts, from within, destroying us and distancing us from God. So no resentment is not that simple, right, in our spiritual life. And it's not about what you think or feel now, but how about in 10 years or in 20 years when you look back? And also maybe when you look at other people and parents to understand them, it's definitely not something we should be accusing other people of. You're resentful, or he's doing it because he's resentful. So one more story, again from Father's life. I'm sure you've heard the story. Father was talking about when he was a child in school. I don't know what age and what it was. He saw some big guy bullying other younger kids in school. Did you hear about the story? Right? And Father was really upset, and he wanted to challenge this guy, but this guy was bigger and he was weaker. So he decided to go in the forest and train, like, punching trees and train himself to fight, so that he could challenge this boy and fight with him and beat him, right? To protect these other people from being bullied. And I think that's also, very helpful story to think about. Why? If we think about how resentments grow, or how culture, like fallen nature, spreads, one way is a lot of people have the fear or are afraid to confront issues, right? So if there's some injustice in a workplace, let's say we're at a company here. Which company should we take? Let's take Deloitte. Don't know anyone who works at Deloitte. And it's probably the most healthy culture, right? You have a healthy culture at Deloitte? Yeah, okay. Let's pretend we don't have a healthy culture, right? I'm the boss of Deloitte. You're the employees, right? So imagine I use my position to bully Javi, right? Yeah, Javi, yeah, I want to be bullied. So I'm the boss, and I bully him. I don't respect his work. I treat him badly, and right? And Sam and Javi are friends, and Sam sees this, right? So in that circumstance, and I've experienced that in my work, so it's not that severe, but it is something that's real, and I haven't just experienced it at work. I've experienced it in several environments, also at school, and maybe at university you have that situation. Professors or someone with a position of power and authority may feel they can use that power to bully or push other people around for their own benefit. So what's Sam going to do, right? So of course he can choose to leave the company, say bad culture, move away. He can choose to ignore it, but on the long run, if you ignore it, like how's his friendship to Javi gonna grow in the next years if he ignores it, if he accepts it? Reality is, when you accept it, you become part of it over time, just by accepting it. Right? That's the nature of fourth fall nature, right? That we want our bad standards to become the standard. We externalize it onto others, and if other people don't push back and accept it, right? Then eventually that becomes the norm in that environment, right? So he could also challenge it. He could report, like in a company that, especially in the West, there is usually some healthy structure, usually in the company, right? If you're managers, you can go to the next higher manager, or you can go to the human resource department, and you can even go to the police. There are laws about protecting workers' rights at workplace and so on, right? In the West, it's more complicated, and it's still happening, and it's more difficult to address, but technically our society has an awareness that as a boss, you can't treat your workers like slaves, right? And that's not okay, and there should be some consensus to go against that. But bullying in school, bullying in these environments, it does happen, and if we're afraid to address it, to confront it, then that's the place where this kind of culture can thrive, right? So do we want to be in the culture of intimidation, fear, of silence? If we are in the position of power, the temptation to use that power to bully is there. If we are immature, if we are not healthy spiritual leaders, if we are not loving people, if we are struggling with our own self-centeredness and fallen nature, and we have a position of power, we have a position of authority in any organization, even in a family, in university, that temptation is always there, right? To use that position, authority, and when we experience that in ourselves, towards us or towards people around us, we always have these three options, right? We can accept it, which will lead eventually to resentment, because we become part of it, and it's not part of our conscience. It's not in our relation to God, in our relation to our brothers and sisters. It will disturb that relationship. So eventually, over time, we may not see it as such a big thing, or we may not value it, but eventually it will lead to us supporting that culture and to becoming resentful. We can run away, and maybe, in some places, I don't think in Benetton it made sense for Astrid to try to fight that culture. She could it's not, I don't know. I think it's better in that case just to go away, because that's a different kind of culture. But anyway, so we can move away. And I think that's the choice most people make in difficult circumstances, if they can. Or we can challenge it. And challenging it is the hardest way. But how to challenge is the next question, right? How to deal with it, non-violence or whatever. But we need to at least make the conviction we don't accept that for us, and we don't become part of that. We need to be a bit conscious and evaluate ourselves, and we can't be resentful, right? We can't just join and accept everything as it is if it's not all right. If we can't change it, but we should at least be conscious, I'm not going to participate in that part, and I'm going to sympathize with those people. And I think that's what Father was doing too. I think my experience in our movement was Father was not very narrow-minded, was very open, very flexible to members, and providing space for different kinds of people. And he could handle people with all kinds of different, he's dealing with fallen nature. And how could he do it? Because he had challenged that within himself, right? Love is more important in principle. And Father was able to handle resentment. I don't think Father didn't struggle with resentment and with pain and persecution. He did. I'm sure he did. right? But it didn't affect his determination to love God. It didn't affect his love for people around him. And so I think that's really important, right? So if we are part of a community, then we should invest to create that. And also passively. So fear of confrontation, I think, is a real danger in our spiritual life. Also in your marriage. You know, if there's something difficult in your marriage and you don't want to talk about it because it's uncomfortable, is that you're going to accept that as your marriage? How are you going to have a loving and fulfilling marriage in those environments, right? And in your community, same, right? So we may not be powerful enough to change everything, but at least we can be conscious of how we interact with it, so that we are part of the process that God can maybe use to change it, hopefully. And if not, that at least we don't become resentful, right? And then one more story. I'm still just bringing stories before I kind of try to bring it full circle. One biblical story. You know the story of Noah, right? Noah was called by God to build the ark, and then he built the ark, and the floods came, and Noah and his family were saved, right? And then they settled on the new land. And then one evening, right, Noah was there. The Bible says he made wine out of grapes. He was a bit drunk, and he was lying naked on the ground, wherever, at the beach, or I don't know where it was. And his family came, and they were ashamed of Noah, and the older brother asked them to cover him up. You remember that story, right? And then Noah, when he woke up and he realized he cursed them, right? Like this was a huge mistake. Why they did that? It's not always easy to understand why. But I think this is very essential, and especially in relating now also to True Father, also to our parents, to ourselves. You know, Father's accomplishments, or Noah's accomplishments, were so great and undeniable. I mean, if you just think about it, right? Let's say you're Ham or whatever. Your dad built an ark, and all of mankind was destroyed, and you were saved, your family, because he followed God's calling to build an ark, right? Shouldn't you trust your father enough to respect him, to not to feel like you can? Does that make sense? Right? So the reason why that was such a problem was not because being naked is bad or something like that, but the reason is his family, they were stuck in fallen culture, right? They were still ashamed. They were still infected by, oh, that's so embarrassing that he's naked or whatever, right? So it didn't. I don't think that's literally what happened, but something happened in that family where they were not able to trust God, or in this case, to trust Noah, despite his accomplishments, despite it being so obvious. So that means, you know, at the end of one's life, we become resentful, right? And somehow we allow our fallen, self-centered thinking to take over and to direct our behavior. And I think, you know, there was a story that we heard from Father, and it was quite similar to Noah's story, and I was quite moved. Right? Like, I think also for Father, right? We should like kind of recognize the value and the good in their life, and not allow that to be corrupted, right? And so, like I said, resentment is, okay, maybe it's not the best explanation, but jealousy leads to resentment, pain leads to resentment, neglect leads to resentment, right, towards our parents or whatever. So it's basically like it's a choice we take where negative, self-centered feelings take over our understanding and our interpretation, and it leads to the four fallen natures: not seeing from God's point of view, leaving a position, reversing order, and spreading evil, right? So pain or negative feelings with us that we accept, that we internalize, that we allow to influence our thinking is what fallen nature is and what it thrives on. It's not that, you know, and that's quite dangerous, right? And the worst thing that's dangerous is usually resentments are justified, right? They make sense. Like if I was mistreated, it's justified for me to resent. It's not like, oh, you're being resentful. That's ridiculous. How could you be resentful? There's no reason for you to resent. You should be above that. No, right? It's justified. It makes sense once we leave God's point of view, right? Once we focus on how I feel, how I was treated. So if we're living a spiritual life, if we try to understand Father's life, Father's call, when Father took up the mission to restore the world, like very general, he wasn't responsible for the problems. He didn't cause the fall. He didn't, right? But he also didn't shift it away. Like, why are you blaming me for this, right? He said, I want to take responsibility, right? I'm going to take responsibility to change this. I didn't cause it, but I'm going to change it. In our movement, there was a time where it came from Love and Life. There was a concept like, with forgiveness and grace, and there was a concept like, if in order to restore something, you have to have experienced it, right? Like, if you want to help someone who's struggling with drugs or with this, if you haven't taken drugs yourself, you cannot understand them, so you cannot restore it. And I heard that recently from someone, and I was thinking, that's such an unprincipled statement. If we understand restoration, right? And even just simply, if you're a doctor, right? If you're trying to cure malaria, you don't have to have malaria to help someone cure malaria, right? That's not a requirement in order for you to be a good doctor or to, right? Father didn't need to make all those mistakes and do everything that was wrong in restoration in order for him to have a foundation to restore it. It's ridiculous. Like, if I want to restore something, how can I add more that needs to be restored in order for it to be restored, right? But if you want to restore something, you have to take responsibility. You have to go into that position, right? You have to go through that struggle, right? That's what restoration is about. So Cain and Abel is about Cain inheriting the archangel's sentiment, but finding a way to resolve it better, right? So being in a position of being jealous, of having someone else take away your sacrifice, of having the potential to become resentful. The first resentment was Lucifer, right? That Adam had more than he did. And that jealousy led to the resentment. I should have self-centered, not seeing God's point of view, that Adam is God's son and I will receive love from him. Does that make sense, right? So, Lucifer had first resentment, and restoration means if I'm going to take responsibility for something that went wrong, right? I don't have to make that mistake. That's not helpful, right? If I made that mistake, then maybe it gives me more incentive to face it and deal with it. But that's not the point. The point is, I may be put in the circumstances where I will have to face the same challenge, that same fallen nature in me, and I have to be victorious. I have to manage no resentment, right, in that circumstance. One of the basic things in our spiritual life was, follow your leader, get a mission, don't be resentful, accept it. If God's guiding, even though it's difficult, digest it, right? But that has to last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, till the end of our life, right? It has to be a real, genuine sacrifice. Restoration is not about... So Father, he had to restore all things in history. So there were points where he was explaining this is, the coronation of Jesus in Israel to restore this situation, right? So Father chose to take responsibility for God and to resolve the situation. But in order to be able to do that, we need a spiritual victory to overcome fallen nature within ourselves. That's just necessary, right? As long as, if we are in a position like in our movement and we are not able to master our fallen nature, we will most likely perpetuate the fallen aspects in the culture that we're in, right? Because we don't have any victory to overcome it. So a spiritual leader's task, I would say, is to fight evil, confront evil in ourselves, in people around us, and to have substantial victories there. That's, I think, most crucial. And the culture we create in our environment we are part of our environment. And maybe at work culture, we can choose to leave it and not to deal with it, but our own family, our own community is too close. We don't really have that choice. At least if we take that choice, then we're homeless, right? We lose our connection to God. So we don't really have the choice to run away. We don't really have the choice to accept it because I mean, of course we have that choice, but it's not a good choice. So we need to somehow have that awareness. How do we deal with it? How do we confront it? How do we address it? Do we help each other? Do we find ways to support each other, protect each other, and challenge it, criticize it? And is there a functioning process in this environment, in our family, that we can do that we can talk about it? And fear of confrontation is just really not a good advisor, I think, because it allows fallen nature a lot more free space. We should be aware our community, also as our movement, is damaged. There is things to work on. Maybe you have older brothers and sisters. Maybe your parents are in that situation. Every situation is different, so it's difficult to generalize it. But I do think that it isn't. There is a reason so many of our elders, my friends, my brothers and sisters, or our parents have left our movement, and I think it's helpful if we honest about it, that don't take it too light, think it's going to be easy. You don't know where you will be in 5 or 10 years, what you will experience, what you will confront, what you will face, right, and how you handle it. So I hope all of us, we can manage no resentment, right, and manage to find ways to support each other, to move on, and not to let it affect us, not to let us lower our spiritual standard that we are trying to accomplish, our love for God, our love for each other as brothers and sisters, that we don't allow certain things like gossiping or bullying or just, discrediting each other or questioning, being suspicious of each other, that we don't allow these things to determine the atmosphere we're in, right? So I think, restoration requires someone to take responsibility, and that it could be just us, right? I don't know who else there is. Who does God have? So in your family, it's definitely you, right? I mean, it should be you. But in your wider community, it can be you, right? It's our choice. So True Father's way was say, God, I will fix it. I will face all persecution, circumstances. And not to be naive that it means we will have to face those struggles, right? We will have to face personally overcoming painful, difficult feelings, difficult circumstances. And I think, having a position in a business or in our movement can be a tricky thing, because having power, having a position could make it seem like we don't need to confront our fallen nature, right? Because we're in a position to decide for others, instruct others. Our members are our subordinates, right? We are telling them we're trying to guide them in their spiritual life. So, we should guide others, but without substantial victories ourselves, without us having some control over our inner fallen nature, this position's power will not lead to good result, right? So taking a position always means serving, right? That's Father's approach, taking responsibility and serving. And we should not be naive and not be unaware of the fact that we have potential to do evil in ourselves, right? We have that potential, and it is a real struggle. And we probably, if we're honest, we know we have made mistakes and hurt people and done things. I think that's just a normal reality. So it's important to state that, to be aware, to be conscious of it, and to determine to do better, right? And to support each other to do better. And when we see other people doing it, not to be indifferent, right? Like in society, everything's about tolerance and letting everyone be who they want to be. If you want to be a man or a woman, you can be that. That's okay, right? Society's teaching us this. And it's said to be like solidarity and tolerance, and to be open and not to hurt anyone and to love everyone. I think it's just indifference, right? I don't care about you. You do what you want. I like spiritually, right? If someone's doing something that's harming them, and you don't want to confront it, you're afraid to confront it, you don't want to challenge them, you can say, it's okay, that's your choice, you do that, right? You go ahead, it's okay, everyone can do what they want. That's just indifference. As a brother and sister, if we look at each other from God's perspective and we see we are struggling, we are acting out of pain and out of difficulties and we're, in our marriage causing problems and so on, we should care enough about each other to be able to confront each other, right? In a healthy way. Confronting doesn't mean fighting and accusing and attacking. A spiritual leader needs to find the way to do it in a loving way, in the right way, but he needs to find the way. He needs to feel that tension, and he needs that tension to be driving him with the sense that I want to take responsibility, not I want to run away and find a way not to take responsibility, right? So to say I'm tolerant is just a way of saying I don't need to care about other people. They can do, I'm not going to impose my will on them. I'm not going to tell them what's right or wrong. I would think in a family, if people we live close to, that would not be acceptable, right? As a parent towards your children, right? I think God doesn't want that kind of a culture. And when we see bullying, there's always, when we see other people being bullied, as long as we're not the victim, too bad, life's tough. Yeah, it's possible. At work, some colleague, anyway, I don't meet him so often, and we just meet at the water cooler every once in a while, small talk. I don't need to worry about how he's doing, right? That's fine. But I don't think that's, in our family, in our community, in our spiritual community, I don't think that's acceptable. Like indifference or neglect or... because it eventually leads to people being in that position of having to choose fight, flight, or accept. Right? We add a third version into fight and flight. So I would maybe not use fight, flight, but leave, accept, and change. Right? So leave, and we don't want our brothers and sisters to leave. We don't want them not to feel comfortable in this community that they choose to leave. We don't want them to accept things that are going against their conscience. So change, how to change. That's really a challenge, I think, in our spiritual life. And evil is really tricky because it has roots in us. That's the reason why it's so difficult, so complicated, and so heavy. It has roots in us, right? So if we can't, when Father talks about, change of lineage, he's talking about unrooting Satan from within our heart, like take out the roots within us, that the deepest part in us where Satan somehow still has a foundation to manipulate us, to affect us, to affect how we think, how we feel, and what we do, right? Because we have fallen nature. There is something within us that's also part of our lineage. That's just reality, right? So how do we unroot that, like completely unroot it? That Satan has no more way of claiming it. That's our spiritual work. That's what Father, I believe, accomplished. That's why he needed to face all these situations to prove to God, to Satan, to himself, that he can manage to still love God and to still love mankind, right? That's what gives him his qualification to be true parents. Now, we may feel, oh, true Father's there and I'm here, right? But at least we should aim for there. We should try, right? And in dealing with each other, we should be able to support each other, even small things, make some steps, right? Because those things are the things we will pass on to our lineage that are valuable. And where we're becoming ignorant or not neglecting it or accepting it or leaving or becoming resentful, then we lose our connection to God eventually. And our spiritual life is dead, right? So our spiritual life needs us to have a pure heart, a pure conscience, to be clear with our conscience, to be connected to the truth, to study the truth, but also to apply it to ourselves, to others. And it's not just about me. So the first thing is, how do I manage not to become resentful? That's my personal responsibility. But how do I create an environment that prevents it from people being in that circumstance, right? And to heal people who may have that issue, because we all do in some sense. So our family and our church is too close for us to think we can just leave it or accept it, or we can go to church, and if we don't like it, we just choose not to go to church. We can choose that, of course, but I would think it's sad because this is too close, right? At university, you'll be there for a few years. If you have a bad professor or whatever, figure a way to protect yourself that it doesn't destroy you, but in 4 years you'll be gone. You don't, right? So maybe that's the best approach. Just protect yourself and get out. you can't change it. Maybe if you have a friend struggling, you can try to challenge it, you can support them and maybe at least help that person, but if you can't change it. But in our family and in our community, that I don't really think that's really an option, because it will just lead to people having to go their own spiritual way alone. And I think I would prefer we can create an environment, especially as second gen, as blessed children, where we feel free to be together, to share, to study Father's words, to reflect deeply, to encourage each other, to challenge each other, to be open-minded for each other, but not in the sense of accepting everything, but to have some basic clear standards, but to find a loving way, and not to accept a culture that will damage that will try to narrow that to very limited, self-centered spiritual point of view. So I don't know if that's helpful, and I hope there's some valuable points of reflection. I think I will conclude here, and thank you very much, and look forward to next.